Thank you for coming in today. We're going to discuss the financial covenants in the proposed draft of the credit agreement. So just generally, financial covenants specify different financial metrics that are designed to measure a borrower's financial health. So in this case, it's going to measure the health of Vault Holdings. The proposed covenants, just generally, the ones that we actually see in those proposed documents are actually called maintenance covenants. And they just basically show they're just general financial metrics that are maintained at all times or over regular periods. These are all pretty standard maintenance covenants and cover, as we will explain later on, either cash flow or balance sheet covenants. So just generally, just to have you understand sort of why these are in documents, lenders want maintenance covenants because they provide early warnings of financial difficulty of borrower. Without financial maintenance covenants, the borrower's financial health could deteriorate, and it could even file for bankruptcy without ever having breached a financial covenant if those were in there. So they basically act as early warning signs for the lenders, so they can be proactive about devising a solution. And also, additionally, maintenance covenants can deter borrowers from pursuing transactions that have a negative impact on cash flow. So that's sort of all what these have to do with. Just whether you can pay back your interests and principal payments and things like that, and whether you're conducting your business in a way that you have an effective cash flow. So going through these 5 financial covenants that we have here, like I said, they're all pretty standard, but we'll go into them more in detail now. So we're going to give you just an overview of each of the covenants and how they work. And then at the end, we're going to give you a synopsis, so just sort of a summary of all the covenants, how they work within each other, and then we'll give you some possible negotiation points to either take them out or do some other things where points of negotiation where we could hopefully benefit you. So the first one in section 2.01 is the consolidated leverage ratio. And just generally speaking, the consolidated leverage ratio just measures how many times the borrower's cash flows covers its debt obligations. It's a measure of the ability of the borrower to repay its debt obligations from its operating cash flow. So this is like a very popular provision, especially in large leverage buyouts, just because they want to be able to accurately determine what your sort of debt ratio is. So, and basically, right, the higher the ratio, the greater the risk. So in our agreement, the proposed agreement, the ratio is as follows. It's the consolidated total debt on any such day minus cash recorded on the balance sheet of the borrower, which does not exceed a specific amount, to the consolidated EBITDA for the most recently completed reference period. So, right, it's basically just consolidated debt to consolidated EBITDA, is generally speaking, in a certain reference period. And just to point out the definition of a reference period, it's either the most recently completed 4-year consecutive fiscal quarters or the fiscal quarters that have been completed up to a certain date. And then there's generally a multiplier to figure it out, with the first full fiscal year equaling 1.33, second fiscal year equaling 2, and then 3 and 4 fiscal years equaling 4. So it's just a multiplier, and that's just all of these definitions have a reference period of how you're supposed to figure it out. So just generally speaking, too, it says you'll have to maintain a consolidated leverage ratio at all times during or as of the last day of each reference period. We would suggest having it being at the last day of each reference period, just so you know when that reference period, or you just know what that date is. It might be easier to maintain it because it's not at all times. It's just at the last day. So that might just be a point of contention where we might want to discuss further with the lender. The second one is section 2.02, the consolidated interest coverage ratio. And again, maintain a consolidated interest coverage ratio at all times, or at least the last day. Again, we probably want the last day, just so you know exactly what that date is, and it doesn't have to meet at all times during that reference period. And the interest coverage ratio measures the ability of the borrower to pay its regular interest payments out of its operating cash flows. It shows the number of times interest expenses can be covered by the borrower's cash flow. indicates that the borrower is able to pay its interest payments, but no more. And then a higher ratio indicates a greater ability to cover its interest payments. And a ratio of less than 1 to 1 means the borrower is not generating enough cash flow to pay its interest payments. So, and then basically the definition though of ours, so the exact definition is just, it's the ratio of consolidated EBITDA for such a period to consolidated interest expense for such periods. That's exactly how we calculate our specific interest coverage ratio in this proposed draft. So those are the two that I'm going to go over today, and then I'm going to pass it to Alex, and he will discuss the last three financial covenants.
Yeah, so as you can see on section 2.03, we have the consolidated fixed charge coverage ratio. Essentially, that measures your ability to pay regular fixed payments out of the operating cash flow. So said another way, it measures the amount of times fixed expenses can be paid by the borrower's cash. In our agreement, that is calculated by doing the consolidated EBITDA minus the capital expenditure plus the consolidated interest expense plus the tax expenses paid. So that ratio will give you the number. 1 means that you can pay out the fixed interest, just that, and anything over like 1.1 means how much more you can pay on top of that. Next, we'll go over to the consolidated net worth on section 2.04. This is a common balance sheet covenant, which essentially means that it's used to measure the borrower's stockholders' equity. So in our agreement, you must maintain the net worth equal to the fiscal quarter ending, and the net worth is pretty simple here. As you can see, it's the excess of the consolidated total assets over the consolidated total liabilities. Next, if you go down, we'll have the minimum consolidated EBITDA, and this is used to establish whether a minimum amount of cash flow from our operations can cover the debt obligations. So you must obtain a certain EBITDA equal to what it was during the end of the fiscal quarter ending. And just to clarify, EBITDA is earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization. So if you look back at our definition for EBITDA, you'll see that let's go right here. It basically goes over what it is. It's basically the EBITDA, and it takes out the interest expenses, the taxes, and so forth. So if we look at some of the other sections, one where I want to give your attention to is section 2.02 and section 2.03. The consolidated interest coverage ratio and the consolidated fixed charge coverage ratio. As you can see, the calculations are pretty similar, at least the components of the calculations, where you're essentially using the consolidated EBITDA and the consolidated interest expense. So if we're looking for something that could be considered duplicative, that we could potentially get out in a covenant, this would be a very good place to start, because it's essentially giving you the same numbers outside of like a few like minor differences. And speaking of solutions, I'm going to send it over to Jake now to go over certain things that we could potentially change in our covenant agreement.
Okay. Hi, Ms. Sun. So, as we discussed, just going off of what my colleague was just talking about, a minimum consolidated EBITDA covenant establishes a minimum amount of cash flow from operations that's available to pay your debt obligations. And we believe that it is not as common a financial covenant as the leverage ratio or coverage ratio as we discussed. And it's actually sometimes used as a prerequisite to closing rather than an ongoing financial covenant. So if it is not used as a prerequisite, we may be able to do away with it completely as a covenant metric. Now, if it's not possible to remove the covenant from the agreement, since it's generally understood that different companies treat different types of income and expense differently, the metrics used to define income and expense could be construed more in your favor, such that the definition of EBITDA would be easier for you to meet the minimum required within the covenants. Now, while many of the covenants we've discussed may have a limited ability to be negotiated, there is precedent for a so-called covenant light agreement, which would be an agreement that has very few covenant terms, and the benchmarks required are low. And in that same vein, BGI has previously done private equity deals in which it has worked with large lenders, so it may be possible to use those benchmarks from prior negotiations in developing those for this agreement. In addition, we also thought it'd be preferable for you to try to negotiate for covenant ratios that are as close to 1-to-1 as possible, such that, for example, with your consolidated leverage ratio, the debt to earnings ratio would be more preferable to you if you were not required to have double earnings in proportion to total debt. And finally, we wanted to briefly discuss a preferential notice and cure period for you, such as in the event of a default or event of breach of covenant, you would have 60 days to cure that breach. We also wanted to discuss what are called equity cure rights, which are provisions that allow your stockholders to inject equity into the company to boost EBITDA if you're at risk of breaching your financial covenants. Now, this would be preferable because you would be able to ask your shareholders to inject more equity into the company so that you meet your covenant benchmark. Sorry, guys, I didn't have a conclusion.
It's fine. Just say thank you.
Oh yeah. So thank you for coming in and giving us your time today.